I would ask you the same question. Do you think that we saw contrasting vision from the two parties? Because in my view, tonight we saw a greater contrast between these two candidates than we've seen in a long time.
Ever.
Certainly
Maybe.
in our lifetimes.
And just the level of thinking, I mean, really, it's a cliche, but it's true. It really was 3 against 1, and the 1 outshone the 3 with ease. Just on something as small as it's not small, but as specifically as the housing crisis, the increase in the cost of housing in the United States. And J.D. Vance makes this very obvious point that, more people means higher costs because there's this thing called supply and demand. If more people want something, its price rises, right? If you have a limited supply, a growing demand, it's just like it's first grade math. And Tim Walz goes, well, can you find a study that shows that? Yeah. And then JD says, well, actually, I think the Fed just did a study the other day that shows that in great detail, but you don't need to point to a study.
The Federal Reserve Bank, we'll send that to you.
Yeah, but then the moderator's like, yeah, do you have a study? I don't know. I mean, you've got to set, it takes a year to build a house. You got 25 million new people. Like, of course, look, it's true in every country in the world. It's true in Canada right now. It's true in Australia. It's true everywhere. So, like, anyone who demands a study to prove something that obvious is like an idiot.
Absolutely. And especially when they ask for it, and it's already been provided by the Federal Reserve Bank, which Democrats generally love, by the way. I loved that entire exchange. I loved how JD handled it. It was a great example of what we've been describing, of JD being the master of the mood of the debate, the master of reason, and of dispassionate but persuasive reasoning. I thought it was fantastic. I also love the fact that he began his answer there by plugging a proposal that I've introduced called the Houses Act. And the Houses Act would require, under certain circumstances, for the federal government to sell surplus federal land for the purpose of building single-family affordable housing. Now, Tim Walz immediately
single family housing. They don't want single-family housing.
They don't want single-family housing. They want all of us to live in a big high-rise
in your pod,
like
yeah.
And they've been pushing this for 10 years on this horrible program called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Program, where they're trying to make the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development this sort of master planner, master zoning commission for the entire country, and giving benefits to local government entities that embrace their zoning, their high-density zoning plans, and punishing those who won't.
Well, you could actually solve these problems in a day if you just drew up a list of, and I can give you the zip codes if you want, but let's just say Martha's Vineyard, Aspen, Bethesda, Maryland, Newton, Massachusetts,
high density. I think those are good places for high density housing. I want to see
and
it.
all the MS-13 baby mamas get free apartments in those new places. So, like,
don't they deserve as much?
That's
Tucker?
super easy to do. We can't do any high density housing unless Martha's Vineyard, Aspen, Bethesda, and Newton get it first.
Right,
like that would end it immediately.
McLean,
100%.
Yeah, exactly. Look, so those guys hate it because they hate single family housing. They don't like that. Tim Walz also interjected by saying,
why do you think they hate single-family housing?
Well, I don't know exactly, but I think it has something to do with the fact that they don't really like families that much.
And human autonomy?
Their family policy is something rather the opposite of a pro-family policy, you might say. Tim Walz then interjects by saying, well, but in some places there's not all that much federal land. Okay, fair enough. But in a lot of states, there is a lot of federal land. In fact, some of the greatest housing crisis that you might find in the United States can be found in the Western United States, where the federal government owns most of the land. Federal government owns almost 70% of the land in my state. And if you took just a tiny fraction of that, we're talking like 0.5% of the federal land in my state, and used it for the Houses Act housing plan, you could, in a fairly short period of time, roughly double the supply of single-family affordable homes just by adopting that legislation. So they really don't like it. And they'll have you believe that all federal land, and then he also threw in this quip about, are you going to be building houses in the same place on the national parks where you're drilling for oil?
Exactly. Putting condos in Yellowstone.
He's never been to the Western United States. These guys think that everything is delicate arch. I can tell you, is a whole bunch of land that is neither beautiful nor the home to some natural wonder. It's just owned by the U.S. government, so we can't tax it. We can't have access
What are they
to it.
doing with 75% of your land?
They use it to bully us. They use it to compel us to an undue obedience to the federal sovereign.
But what are they doing with it? I mean, is it one big biolab or what is it?
Most of it sits fallow. Most of it sits without being used for anything. Now, there's not a property owner on planet Earth who can afford to own that much land, especially in a developed country like ours, and let it sit fallow. But they get away with it because they don't have to pay taxes on it. And that further impoverishes states in the West, like mine, where the federal government owns most of the land because they don't pay property taxes.
And this is not, these are not national parks.
No, we don't fight the stuff on the parks. We like our parks.
Of course.
The parks are also a tiny fragment, a tiny segment of a vast empire. You know, the federal government owns close to 30% of the total land mass of the United States. People east of Colorado are hardly aware of that because the federal government in most cases owns a percentage of land that can be reckoned at the low single digits in those states. But in the West, this is a big deal. And it's costly, but the folks—
Are they good stewards of it?
They're terrible. It actually, they do it all in the name of environmental conservation. They claim that if they didn't own all this land, it would be an environmental post-apocalyptic hellscape of sorts.
Well, I thought
they're terrible at managing it.
Well, the federal government has poisoned the air and water more than anybody.
Yes.
Look at Camp Lejeune. Any military base is filled with PCBs and.
No, that's right. But you don't even have to go to the PCBs, which you'll see something like that on a military installation, before seeing that the federal government's a poor steward. Just look at what they do to unpopulated, unused federal land. They mismanage it to the point that they allow fuel buildup, meaning trees, brush to become overgrown. They refuse to allow any kind of timber harvesting or for you to cut sort of a firewall swath in the middle of it. They refuse to allow the locals to treat for bark beetle infestation, for example. Then forest fires happen. The forest fire destroys the air quality, it destroys the watershed, and it destroys the interest of adjacent landowners.
It's also a massive carbon emission.
Huge, massive.
More than your Suburban.
Exactly. So look, if these guys cared about the environment, they would not want the federal government owning 30% of the land of the United States. Sure as heck wouldn't want them owning 70% of Utah.
So maybe it's about power, not conservation.
It is 100% about power. They love the idea of something as fundamental as land being managed by distant bureaucrats, not elected by the people, utterly unaccountable to the people, 2,000 miles away from the people, who then become more and more dependent on the federal government for that reason. This stuff has been talked about. It's been warned of since the time of the Constitutional Convention. In fact, on September 3rd, 1787, it was raised at the Constitutional Convention, an exchange between Elbridge Gerry and Gouverneur Morris. They talked about this risk of this power. What if we give the federal government all this power over these federal lands? They could use it to manipulate the states into an undue obedience to the general government. We've been ignoring those risks for a long time. That's one of the reasons why we need reforms like the Houses Act.
So you heard Walls make reference to something I'm embarrassed to say I was not aware of. Kamala Harris's plan to build 3 million housing units?
Yeah. I think this is either just before or after the unicorns arrive. And the unicorns, being possessed as they are with these magical qualities, they can print money without causing inflation.
They can.
I look forward to the unicorn plan.
I don't know anything about it, but I am dead certain this is a payoff to their developer donors.
Right.
It always is. It's high density housing in your neighborhood because they hate you and your neighborhood, and their friends are getting rich from it. I just know that that's true.
And rest assured, Tucker, that because Kamala is going to be handing out $25,000 checks for anyone who gains access to any of that housing, that the cost of housing will end up going up by exactly $25,000.
Aren't we at $1 trillion annual debt service at this point? Right.
Yes.
So
$1 trillion a year just to pay the interest on our debt.
Yeah. So where do we get the money for all this stuff?
They have not answered that question.
When does the merry-go-round stop spinning?
Well, Look, in order to have more money, because we're the world's reserve currency, it's been fairly easy for them to effectively print money. Now, it's a little more complicated than that. They have to go through a treasury auction process. People buy the bonds, then we print more money. But the problem is, as we get more and more in debt, and as we have to pay, just a few years ago, we were paying 350 billion a year in interest. It's mushroomed in the last couple of years as we've been spending so much more money. Sooner or later, you get to the point where you can't issue enough bonds to keep up with that, not without paying much, much higher yield rates on your bonds. And that's where the money really is going to run out. And that's where we could, in very short order, see the US dollar's status as the world's reserve currency dropping into the Atlantic Ocean, never to be seen again in our lifetimes.
And then what
That's
happens?
truly scary. Well, then we, as a people, endure one of the single greatest upheavals that our country has ever known, and one of the greatest economic upheavals that any group of people could go through. Because when you've been used to the blessings, the benefits associated with having the world's reserve currency be your country's currency, all kinds of things happen. And it becomes harder and harder for people to gain access to money they need to start a business or start a family or do whatever.
Do you
they
think
need
this
to
is
do.
why gold is at $2,600 an ounce?
Absolutely. And I suspect we're nowhere near seeing the end of that trend, because people will be sending their money not just into gold, but into any other asset, because the U.S. dollar is losing its value like crazy, much as they're trying to hide it. They can't hide from the fact that housing and groceries and gasoline they've all gone up by somewhere between 20 and 31, 32%. That's even according to their own numbers, which are probably understating the problem.
Is there any way to avert this disaster?
Sure. We could avert it by electing government officials who are willing to say, we don't draw from an unlimited well of money.